Welcome students to another one of your flipped lectures, and today we're going to be discussing the Iraq War. The Iraq War lasted from March of 2003 to December of 2011. It was a very long conflict that was very controversial in United States history. So let's take a look at where Iraq is on the map. As you can see, it's right in the middle of what is considered the Middle East region of the world. Here's a close-up map of Iraq. You can see where all of the major cities are located. So let's talk for a second about the Iraqi people in the country. It's a country made up of about 31 million people, and within that there are different ethnic and religious groups. The Kurds make up 15 to 20%, and they are an ethnic minority group. The rest of the population is mostly made up of Arabic ethnic people. The dominant religion within Iraq is Islam, but the two different sects of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia Muslims, basically have a split along kind of a 35-65%. This would cause some internal conflicts, and also there's about 3% of Christians in the country. Before we dive into the Iraq War that you guys are all familiar with, we need to talk about the first Iraq War, which was known as the Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm. And that took place from August 2nd of 1990 to February 28th of 1991. So in the 1990s, Iraq was ruled by a man called Saddam Hussein, and he ruled the country through a brutal military dictatorship. But on August 2nd of 1990, he decided to take his army and invade the nation of Kuwait. His goal for this invasion was to basically gain access to Kuwait's oil. After the invasion, the United Nations gave an ultimatum to the Iraqi army and told them to leave Kuwait or face consequences. Saddam Hussein refused to leave Kuwait, and those consequences would come. Here's the map again. You can see the country of Kuwait is just to the south of Iraq. So let's talk about Operation Desert Storm. After the Second Iraq War, this was basically sometimes referred to as the First Iraq War. And this basically involved a 6-week bombing and missile campaign, where essentially the United States and United Nations bombed and sent missiles to basically attack the Iraqi army. Then after that, a massive land assault was undertaken, but the ground war only lasted 100 hours. Clear advantages in both air and land power led to the Allied forces under the United Nations, causing the Iraqi forces to retreat or surrender. A ceasefire would be signed that would end the conflict with Iraq. One of the interesting things about the Gulf War and Operation Desert Storm was that a lot of familiar faces who will be involved in the Second Iraq War are going to come back up. The man sitting on the left is General Colin Powell. He would eventually be Secretary of State under President George W. Bush. The Vice President of the United States under George W. Bush would also be involved in the First Iraq War, Operation Desert Storm, but back then he was the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney. And the president at the time of the Gulf War was actually George W. Bush's father, President George H. W. Bush. So as you can see, there's a lot of connections between the Gulf War and then the Second Iraq War. So let's fast forward to the country of Iraq in 2002. Saddam Hussein was still in power with his military dictatorship, because the United States, as part of the Gulf War, had not removed him from power. In 2002, George W. Bush gave the State of the Union address to the country. In it, he identified the axis of evil.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Thank you all, please. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, Vice President Cheney, members of Congress, distinguished guests, fellow citizens. As we gather tonight, our nation is at war, our economy is in recession, and the civilized world faces unprecedented dangers. Yet the state of our union has never been stronger. We last met in an hour of shock and suffering. In 4 short months, our nation has comforted the victims, begun to rebuild New York and the Pentagon, rallied a great coalition, captured, arrested, and rid the world of thousands of terrorists, destroyed Afghanistan's terrorist training camps, saved the people from starvation, and freed a country from brutal oppression. The American flag flies again over our embassy in Kabul. Terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay. And terrorist leaders who urged followers to sacrifice their lives are running for their own. When I called our troops into action, I did so with complete confidence in their courage and skill. And tonight, thanks to them, we are winning the war on terror. The men and women of our armed forces have delivered a message now clear to every enemy of the United States, even 7,000 miles away, across oceans and continents, on mountaintops and in caves. You will not escape the justice of this nation. For many Americans, these 4 months have brought sorrow and pain that will never completely go away. Every day, a retired firefighter returns to ground zero to feel closer to his 2 sons who died there. At a memorial in New York, a little boy left his football with a note for his lost father. Dear Daddy, please take this to heaven. I don't want to play football until I can play with you again someday. Last month at the grave of her husband, Michael, a CIA officer and Marine who died in Mazar-e-Sharif, Shannon Spann said these words of farewell: Semper Fi, my love. Shannon is with us tonight. Shannon, I assure you and all who have lost a loved one that our cause is just and our country will never forget the debt we owe Michael and all who gave their lives for freedom. Our cause is just, and it continues. Our discoveries in Afghanistan confirmed our worst fears and showed us the true scope of the task ahead. We have seen the depth of our enemies' hatred in videos where they laugh about the loss of innocent life. But some governments will be timid in the face of terror. And make no mistake about it, if they do not act, America will. Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since September the 11th, but we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic. We will work closely with our coalition to deny terrorists and their state sponsors the materials, technology, and expertise to make and deliver weapons of mass destruction. We will develop and deploy effective missile defenses to protect America and our allies from sudden attack. And all nations should know America will do what is necessary to ensure our nation's security. We'll be deliberate, yet time is not on our side. I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
Watched. That was the State of the Union address in January of 2002, the first State of the Union address after the Afghanistan War and after the events of 9/11. And in the speech, George W. Bush identified regimes that the United States believed threaten world security. These nations included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. In the speech, the President accuses them of sponsoring terrorism and developing weapons of mass destruction. So why is Iraq targeted? There are a couple of reasons. The first is that the country was seen as a danger to world security. The events of the first Gulf War, as well as intelligence found of biological and chemical weapons, made the United States and the rest of the world community question whether or not Saddam Hussein was still possessing weapons of mass destruction. Now, he had used these weapons in the past against both Iran and his own people, but the intelligence suggested that Iraq currently, at the time, in 2002, possessed these types of weapons. When we talk about weapons of mass destruction, we're referring to chemical weapons, biological weapons, and both the development of and possession of nuclear weapons. So the United States gave an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein's regime. The United States asked the United Nations to demand that Iraq surrendered all of their weapons of mass destruction, allowed United Nations weapons inspectors to go into Iraq and basically investigate whether or not there were these weapons of mass destruction. They said that Iraq needed to cease support of all terrorist organizations, as well as cease the oppression of the Iraqi people. In response to this ultimatum, the United States Congress voted to authorize the use of military force against Iraq. So at this point, the President of the United States had the full authority to use the military against Iraq. In an effort to prevent military action, Saddam Hussein in Iraq agreed to let the United Nations send in weapons inspectors, and they told the United Nations that they currently possess no weapons of mass destruction. However, these investigators were not given full access to everywhere in the country, which made the United States suspicious. Here's a picture of the Secretary of State Colin Powell basically addressing the UN, asking them to take action against Saddam Hussein. So at this point, the United States and President George W. Bush had to decide whether or not to carry out a war in Iraq. The reason for war was that if Iraq developed or acquired weapons of mass destruction, they could pose a direct threat to the United States. The belief that basically these weapons would be used either on the United States or on their close allies. But there were also a couple of other secondary reasons, smaller reasons. And one of them said that there was a link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. The CIA and other intelligence basically suggested that these organizations could be working together. There were also a long list of human rights violations committed by Saddam Hussein's regime. And there was also the idea that the United States wanted to bring democracy into Iraq and bring democracy into the Middle East. So the decision was made to take a preemptive strike against Iraq. Preemptive means that basically it is an attack without being directly provoked. And the United States also made this decision without the approval of the United Nations. So at this point, the United States chose to go it alone. So on March 20th of 2003, at 5:34 a.m., the Iraq War begins with a bombing campaign aimed at Saddam Hussein's palace in Baghdad.
Okay. All right, I didn't say it.
The initial surprise attack and invasion was known as the shock and awe phase, in the hope that the overwhelming force of United States, both bombs and soldiers, would mean that the Iraq War would end very quickly. So in 2003, the United States was now at war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. So let's run down the United States' goals for the Iraq War, and we can identify 7 of them. The first is the overthrow of the regime of Saddam Hussein. One of the main goals was to get Saddam Hussein out of power and get a new government in. The second was to find and eliminate all weapons of mass destruction. They also wanted to locate and capture all of the terrorists that were operating in Iraq, gather any sort of information and intelligence on a global network of illegal weapons creation, deliver humanitarian aid to Iraqi citizens, secure the natural resources, such as oil, and return them to the Iraqi people, and create conditions for a transition to a democratic government. So let's talk about the Iraq Invasion Coalition. The United States is not going to enjoy the same international support that it had during the Afghanistan War. This war was not supported by the United Nations, and the United States and Great Britain are going to make up most of the action in Iraq. Australia and Poland will also be involved, but really this is a war that is going to be led by the United States. So let's talk about the start of the Iraq War, which is known as the invasion phase, which only lasted from March 20th to April 9th of 2003. As you can see, United States tanks and firepower bring a considerable advantage to this war. So let's talk about the battle for Baghdad. Baghdad was the capital of Iraq, so it was very important that the United States take it as quickly as possible. And the soldiers had to fight, house to house, building to building, in order to secure the city and defeat Iraqi army forces.
Well, real quickly, Bridget, Doha, not only the headquarters of Central Command, it's also the headquarters of Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera is carrying these very same pictures, so they are playing all over the Arab and Muslim world. They are seeing the same images we're watching right now on Fox.
There's attention on the rope now. The engine goes. And he's about to fall.
He's tipping.
Oh, they're broken up at both legs right now. But I guess the own weight of the statue is going to take care of the rest very soon. Here we go. This is unbelievable. So there he's hanging.
It's hard to keep the people away. Chris Youngfeld
throwing rocks at him, and the pieces of metal, wood, whatever, their shoes. The people that are throwing whatever they can find. They're throwing it at this statue now from underneath.
Incredible sight.
Isn't that something? They said Saddam would cling to power, and now the statue is hanging on.
The throwing of the shoes, Chris Youngfeld, you can jump in here. You know more about Arabic culture than I do, but there's a certain symbolism in throwing. There he goes. I hope they're watching this all over the Arab Street. Indeed, our own John Scott said that Al Jazeera is broadcasting these scenes. Jubilant seems too mild a word for what you're seeing here as the citizens of Baghdad are on top of this statue. Go ahead, Britt.
I wonder what Dominique de Villepin and Jacques Chirac are saying if they're watching right now.
Dominique, of course, being the foreign minister of France, and his boss, the president of France, who, of course, opposed the liberation of Iraq at every step along the way. And Britt, we should say, who, of course, now want to get back in.
Well, yes, it does. So they want through the UN door, which appears to be only ajar at the moment.
So the capital of Iraq, Baghdad, fell to United States forces on April 9th of 2003. Symbolically, the statue of Saddam Hussein was torn down. So that marked the victory over the Iraqi army, and that ended the invasion phase. The invasion didn't take very long. However, the Iraq War was just beginning. But on May 1st, President of the United States, George W. Bush, gave a speech in which he declared that the United States had accomplished its mission in Iraq. However, though the president said the mission had been accomplished, Saddam Hussein had not yet been captured. Large insurgent forces had remained active, and no new Iraqi government was in place. So, a lot of historians will look back at this moment and say that victory was prematurely declared. So now the United States and Great Britain and its allies had to enter the second phase of the Iraq War, the occupation and nation-building phase. As with Afghanistan, it's very easy to win the war, but it's very difficult to win the peace. And this phase would last from May of 2003 to December of 2011. So the fighting continued in Iraq, because a large-scale insurgency continued fighting. So now, instead of fighting a formal army that Saddam Hussein led, the United States now had to fight a group of guerrilla fighters. This was made up of the remains of Hussein's forces, Iraqis who were opposed to the United States continuing to occupy the country after the fall of Saddam's regime, various members of terrorist organizations, and Middle Eastern radical groups that wanted to basically stop the United States occupation. This insurgency would use unconventional warfare, sabotage, and guerrilla tactics that would make it very hard for the United States to defeat these forces. Here are some images of those insurgents. Saddam Hussein had avoided capture during the early phases of the war. However, by December of 2003, he was on the run. And he was captured by United States forces in December, found hiding inside a hole in the ground. So Saddam Hussein was put on trial by the Iraqi interim government. This was a temporary government set up in order to try to transition the country from Saddam's rule into a democracy. This government tried Saddam Hussein for crimes against humanity and ultimately sentenced him to death. He was executed as a result of this trial. So now we have to talk about the difficulties in Iraq. Nation building is a very hard thing to do. But the United States and the coalition create a transitional government. They help the Iraqis draft a constitution, and they set up a parliamentary democracy. And the country held its first free elections in December of 2005, about 2 years after the capture of Saddam Hussein. The United States also provided money for rebuilding the nation after the war, and also took the lead in training the new Iraqi security forces and army. But the Iraq War was far from over in 2003. It would have to continue against that different enemy. Which leads us to the Battle of Fallujah. In November of 2003, the largest battle of the Iraq War began. If you would like to get a better sense of what this battle looked like, the house-to-house urban warfare, you can go to the headline page and go to Safari Montage and see the video, The Battle of Fallujah News and Combat Footage. A quick warning, this video contains some pretty graphic content, and so you are not required to watch this. Here are some more images of the Battle of Fallujah. So, while fighting the insurgency, the United States underwent a series of what were known as troop surges, as well as troop reductions. In 2007, the United States decided to send 20,000 more soldiers to Iraq to try to provide security in urban areas that had come under attack by insurgents. In 2008 to 2011, the Iraqi military was finally ready to begin taking over the main responsibility for the security of Iraq. And so in 2008, President George W. Bush set a timetable for the United States withdrawal, hoping that all United States troops would be able to be out of the country by December of 2011. After taking over the presidency, Barack Obama kept to President Bush's original timeline for the withdrawal of United States troops. So, on October 21st of 2011, President Obama announced the end of all U.S. military operations in Iraq. And in December of that same year, the Iraq War was declared officially over with a flag-lowering ceremony in Baghdad. However, the war between the Iraqi government and the insurgency has continued since. So let's talk about the legacy of the Iraq War. There's going to be a couple of legacies. Let's first talk about the short-term one. The Iraq War, much more than the war in Afghanistan, divided the United States. There were large anti-war protests, and this really divided the country along those who thought the Iraq War was a good idea and those who wanted the United States to be out. And the attitudes towards the Iraq War changed considerably as the war went on. In May of 2003, CNN polled, and it showed that 79% of the population supported the Iraq War. But just 3 years later, in October of 2006, the same CNN poll showed that 61% of people were now against the Iraq War. That's a massive swing. But there was always an anti-war movement that was active in the United States from the start of the invasion. The Iraq War bitterly divided the country, and in fact, it still is dividing the country to this day. Many still support the Iraq War, and many still believe that it was a bad idea, and even that it was illegal. There's one other thing from Iraq that I want to address. The fact that there was a prison abuse scandal that undermined the U.S. credibility in Iraq. In 2004, it came out that United States soldiers had been abusing prisoners in Iraq. This was both done by the United States military and the CIA. And these are things that the United States, on principle, always should oppose. So the very fact that the United States, which came into the Iraq War with kind of a moral superiority, trying to liberate the Iraqi people, were now shown to have been carrying out the kinds of abuses that the United States condemned Saddam Hussein for. This undermined a lot of U.S. credibility around the world, and it really increased opposition to the war. So let's talk about the cost of the Iraq War. In terms of casualties, the United States and its allies lost about 24,219 soldiers. The United States itself lost 4,487. And the opposition forces, the forces the United States was fighting, lost between 28,000 and 38,000. This war cost the United States between $3 and $6 trillion. The exact figures have not yet been calculated. But if we look at the civilian casualties, approximately 103,000 to 114,000 civilians were killed in this war. And almost all the major cities and infrastructure, that's roads and electricity, were destroyed during this war as well. So was the Iraq War a success or a failure? The reality is that it's too soon to tell. History will judge that. But the short-term successes were that Saddam Hussein was overthrown, and a new democratic government was put in place. However, some of the failures were that the United States failed to find evidence of weapons of mass destruction. It also failed to find significant evidence connecting Hussein to al-Qaeda. There were also large civilian casualties, the prison scandal, and an ongoing internal military and political conflict in Iraq. The Iraq War has not ended. The United States' involvement simply has. So it's interesting to think of the Iraq War as either success or failure, because many of the reasons for going into war were proven to be false. But yet, there were some successes. So history, and ultimately you, will have to be the judge of whether or not this war was successful or disastrous. So we have now talked about two conflicts in the war on terror. And these wars have a lasting legacy on the United States. So it is up to you to decide how the United States is going to wield its power in the future.